Stop. You haven't subscribed to the channel yet. Subscribe now. We have new stories every day. Now, let's go. James Alvarez strode toward his gate under the harsh fluorescent lights of the New York LaGuardia terminal, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. A delayed flight meant another late night, but that didn't bother him. Success demanded sacrifice, and he built his tech empire on that understanding. His phone vibrated with another text from Helen. Landing soon. Miss you. James's thumb hovered over the screen. After 20 years in the tech industry, he had developed an almost preternatural sense for system glitches, for code that didn't quite compile. Lately, that same sense had been prickling at the edges of his consciousness whenever Helen messaged. Her text felt automated, like chatbot responses programmed to simulate affection. About to board. Home in a few hours. He pocketed the phone without waiting for her reply. The boarding gate was nearly empty, most passengers having opted for earlier flights. James settled into a first-class seat, declining the flight attendant's offer of pre-takeoff champagne. He needed a clear head. Something about this trip had felt off from the start. The meetings had gone well. They always did. James hadn't built Alvarez Solutions from the ground up by failing to close deals, but Helen's insistence that he extend the trip by 3 days had struck him as odd. She claimed it would give him more time to solidify partnerships, but since when had she taken such an interest in his business strategy? As the plane lifted into the night sky, James opened his laptop, scanning through recent emails. A message from Victor, his assistant and longtime friend, caught his attention. Needed to discuss something when you're back. In person. Victor wasn't one for cryptic messages. In 15 years of working together, he'd always been direct, sometimes brutally so. It was one of the reasons James had kept him close through every expansion, every new venture. That and Victor's uncanny ability to spot trouble before it surfaced. The flight passed in a blur of contract reviews and strategy documents. By the time they touched down in his home city, James had almost convinced himself he was being paranoid. Helen's distant behavior, Victor's unusual message, maybe it was all just stress catching up with him. The airport was quiet at this hour, his footsteps echoing through near-empty corridors. In the premium parking lot, his Tesla waited where he'd left it a week ago. The familiar leather seat embraced him as he settled in, the car's systems humming to life with their usual efficiency. The drive home took him through the sleeping city, past darkened office buildings, and the occasional late-night diner. He'd made this journey countless times, but tonight felt different, like a familiar piece of code that looked wrong after too many hours of debugging. Nothing obvious, just an instinct that something wasn't quite right. Their house appeared ahead, a Tudor revival masterpiece he bought when his first major software platform went public. Most of the windows were dark, but lights spilled from the kitchen and what appeared to be the living room. James checked the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. late, but not unusually so for his family. Diana often studied well into the night, preparing for her AP exams with the same intensity he brought to his business dealings. He pulled into the circular driveway rather than the garage, cutting the engine before the Tesla's quiet hum could announce his arrival. The keys slid into the lock with familiar ease, the door opening without a sound. He'd had all the hinges oiled last month, a detail Helen had teased him about. Always the perfectionist, she'd said, with what he now realized might have been mockery rather than affection. The foyer was dark, but warm light spilled from the kitchen, along with a low murmur of voices. James started to call out, then stopped. Something in those voices, their tone, their cadence, made him pause. Instead of announcing himself, he found his feet carrying him silently across the hardwood floors, years of martial arts training unconsciously guiding his movements. Your dad, just a walking bank. Helen's voice, clear and contemptuous, stopped him cold just outside the kitchen doorway. Your real father, Jared, will take care of us. The words hit him like a physical blow, each syllable a precisely targeted strike. Jared Thompson, Helen's colleague at the real estate firm, The one she'd started mentioning casually about a year ago. The one whose name appeared too often in her text messages, always explained away with professional excuses. Once we've got what we need, Helen continued, her voice taking on a tone he'd never heard before, calculating, almost predatory. I'll take him for the house and even his prized assistant, Victor, in the divorce. From his position just outside the kitchen, James could see Helen's reflection in the window above the sink. She leaned against the marble counter, wearing the silk robe he bought her last Christmas in Seville. A wine glass dangled from her perfectly manicured fingers, fingers that still wore his grandmother's diamond ring. Her lips curved in a smile that transformed her face into something alien and cold. "I know, Mom." Diana's voice drove the knife deeper, twisting it in his gut. "We just need to play along until it's all set." The briefcase nearly slipped from James's grip. He caught it before it could hit the floor, his reactions, honed by years of martial arts, kicking in despite the shock threatening to overwhelm him. Diana, his daughter. The little girl who used to wake him at dawn to watch cartoons together, who'd begged him to teach her coding when she was 12, showing the same passion for technology that had driven his own success. "Jared says we can move to the coast once everything's settled." Helen's voice took on a dreamy quality. "Maybe that beach house in Coral Bay you liked so much when we visited last summer." James's mind flashed back to that trip. He'd been on conference calls most of the time, dealing with a security breach at one of their data centers. Helen and Diana had spent days exploring the coastline without him. With Jared, apparently. That would be amazing. Diana's enthusiasm felt like acid in his ears, and Dad's so caught up in his work he'll never see it coming. A laugh from Helen, light and musical, the same laugh that had captivated him at a tech conference 2 decades ago. He's always been blind to anything that isn't coded in zeros and ones. "Remember last month when I told him I was having dinner with the real estate team? I was actually helping Jared pick out our new bedroom furniture." "Mom." Diana's scandalized giggle. "Too much information." "Sorry, sweetie, but you have to admit it's almost too easy. Your father trusts me completely with the accounts I handle. He never even checks the transactions." James's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms. That trust had been deliberate. He'd given Helen access to significant funds, wanting her to feel secure, appreciated, wanting to make up for the long hours and missed dinners that building an empire demanded. "Jared says Dad's lucky he hasn't lost everything already." Diana's voice took on a strange tone, part contempt, part something else. "Guilt, maybe. He says your father's too focused on his computers to see what's happening right in front of him." Helen's voice softened. "He understands what a woman needs: attention, romance, time. When was the last time your father took us anywhere without his laptop?" James backed away from the kitchen, each step measured and silent. His mind, trained to process complex problems at lightning speed, was already cataloging years of suspicious moments. Helen's increased interest in their finances, the joint account she'd insisted they open for emergency expenses, Diana's gradual withdrawal, the way she'd stopped coming to his home office to share her coding projects. He made it to his study without a sound, closing the heavy oak door with excruciating care. The room that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to mock him with evidence of his blindness. Family photos covered every surface. Helen and Diana at the beach, the 3 of them at Diana's middle school graduation, his daughter's first coding competition, where she'd taken first place with an app they developed together. All eyes. The leather chair creaked softly as he sank into it. Another gift from Helen, delivered with a kiss and a complaint about how much time he spent working. Had she been meeting Jared that day too, planning their future while spending his money on presents meant to maintain his ignorance? James pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over Victor's contact. The cryptic message from earlier took on new significance. Had Victor noticed something? Tried to warn him? But no, Helen had mentioned him specifically. Prized assistant, Victor. Was she planning to poach him in the divorce, or was Victor already compromised? The security of his entire operation could be at risk. Helen had access to sensitive information, personal and professional. She knew his schedules, his passwords, his business strategies. How much had she shared with Jared? James opened his laptop, accessing the home security system. The cameras he'd installed for their protection would now serve a different purpose. He pulled up a shopping site, adding newer, more discreet models to his cart. Premium shipping. He needed them immediately. As he worked, voices drifted up from below. Helen and Diana were still talking, their laughter floating through the floor like poison gas. He opened another browser tab, searching for Jared Thompson. The man's real estate profile appeared, square-jawed, confident smile, testimonials praising his personal touch with clients. James's finger tapped his desk, a habit from his coding days when tracking down particularly elusive bugs. The timeline was becoming clear. Jared had joined Helen's firm 18 months ago. Shortly after, Helen had suggested they open that joint account. Then came the questions about his business, casual inquiries about specific clients and contracts. He'd thought she was finally taking an interest in his work. Dawn found him still at his desk, having spent the night reviewing financial statements and security footage from the past few months. The evidence was there in 100 small moments he'd overlooked. Helen's car in the firm's parking lot long after official hours, Diana's secretive phone calls, money moving through their accounts in patterns that suggested careful planning. Movement downstairs pulled his attention from the screens. Helen's morning routine beginning, the coffee maker's familiar gurgle, cabinets opening and closing. Soon she'd come up with his morning coffee, playing the role of devoted wife. Diana would appear for breakfast, acting the part of loving daughter. James straightened his tie and stood, shoulders squared. His reflection in the office window showed no sign of a sleepless night. Good. They wanted to play games. Fine. He would play. But they'd soon learn that business wasn't the only arena where he excelled at strategy. He opened his office door just as Helen reached the top of the stairs, coffee cup in hand. Her eyes widened in perfectly feigned surprise, full lips parting in a practiced smile. James. She moved to kiss him, but he turned slightly, making it land on his cheek instead. If she noticed the evasion, she didn't show it. When did you get home? I didn't hear you come in. Just now, he lied smoothly, watching her face for any flicker of doubt. Didn't want to wake you. You must be exhausted, she said, touching his arm, concern radiating from her green eyes. Such a convincing performance. Had she always been this good an actress, or had practice with Jared improved her skills? Let me make you breakfast. That would be great. He smiled, matching her act with one of his own. Is Diana up? I brought her something from my trip. Dad. Diana appeared in the hallway, still in her pajamas, the ones he bought her in South Korea last year. She hesitated for just a moment. He caught it now. That slight pause before she moved to hug him. You're back early. Couldn't stay away from my girls. The words felt like shards of glass in his mouth. He hugged her back, noting the stiffness in her embrace that he previously attributed to teenage awkwardness. Had she been this adept at deception when she was younger, or was this a skill Helen had taught her? Come on, Helen said, taking his arm. You can tell us all about your trip over breakfast. James let her lead him downstairs, his mind already mapping out his next moves. He needed to verify Victor's loyalty, consult with lawyers, examine every asset, every account, every contract Helen might have accessed. But first, he needed more evidence, needed to understand just how deep this betrayal went. How about pancakes? Helen asked, already pulling out mixing bowls. Your favorite. Perfect. James sat at the kitchen island, the same spot where they'd stood last night, plotting his downfall. Everything's perfect. He watched them move around the kitchen, mother and daughter exchanging glances they thought he couldn't see. Each smile, each casual touch, each seemingly innocent question about his business took on new meaning. They were gathering intelligence, he realized, Every detail he shared would be ammunition for their plans. Then he gave them what they wanted: carefully curated information about his trip, a few complaints about potential business troubles, hints about investments that weren't performing as well as expected. With each tidbit, he watched their reactions, noting the subtle signs of satisfaction when they thought he was revealing vulnerabilities. The Chung contract might fall through, he mentioned casually, watching Helen's hand pause momentarily as she poured coffee. Their legal team found some issues. Oh no, Helen's sympathy sounded genuine. She'd always been good at this part. Anything serious? Nothing we can't handle. He shrugged, noting how Diana's eyes flicked to her mother. Just might take longer than expected to close the deal. I'm sure you'll figure it out, Dad, Diana said, her tone encouraging. You always do. Until now, he thought. Her unspoken words seemed to hang in the air. James took a bite of pancake, tasting nothing. I should get ready for school, Diana announced eventually, sliding off her stool. She kissed his cheek. When had her kisses started feeling so calculated? I'm glad you're home, Dad. Me too, sweetheart. The endearment was automatic, but it no longer held the same warmth, not when he could still hear her voice from last night. We just need to play along. Helen began cleaning up, humming softly as she loaded the dishwasher. Such a perfect picture of domestic contentment. How many mornings had he watched her like this, believing himself the luckiest man alive? How many times had she performed this routine while planning his destruction? I need to head to the office, he said, standing. A lot of catching up to do. Already? Helen pouted playfully, and he wondered if she'd practiced that expression in front of Jared. I thought we might have lunch together. Make up for lost time. The suggestion sent a chill down his spine. How many of their lunches had been followed by meetings with Jared? How many times had she used their dates as cover for her real activities? Can't today, but rain check. He forced another smile as she nodded, watching him pull out his phone, setting his own plans in motion. The first text went to Victor. Need to meet. Urgent. Usual place. 1 hour. The second went to his security consultant about the new cameras. The third went to his lawyer, requesting a discreet appointment. Helen watched him type, and he could practically see her mind working, trying to decode his messages. Let her wonder. Let her think she still had the upper hand. Don't work too hard, she called as he headed for the door. We should do something special for dinner. Looking forward to it, he replied, the lie coming easily now. In his car, James sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. The morning sun caught his wedding ring, and for the first time, he noticed how it weighed on his hand, like a shackle, a symbol not of love and commitment, but of his own blind trust. He started the engine, his mind already racing with plans and contingencies. They thought he was just a walking bank. They'd learn otherwise. James Alvarez hadn't built his empire by being naive or easily manipulated. He hadn't survived 2 decades in the cutthroat tech industry by showing mercy to those who betrayed him. The game was on, and he intended to win. The morning crowd at Vertex Coffee had thinned to a handful of laptop-focused professionals when Victor arrived exactly 1 hour after James's text. The cafe had been their meeting spot for sensitive discussions since the early days of Alvarez Solutions, when they plotted their first startup strategy over cheap espresso and day-old muffins. Now, 15 years later, they owned the building, but some habits died hard. Victor spotted James in their usual corner booth, an untouched espresso cooling in front of him. The signs of a sleepless night were evident in the subtle shadows under James's eyes, the slight disarray of his usually immaculate suit. You look like hell, Victor said, sliding into the booth. He studied his friend's face, noting the rigid set of his jaw. What happened? James's fingers drummed once on the table, a tell from his coding days when hunting particularly nasty bugs. What were you going to tell me before I left for New York? You're going to have to be more specific. Victor's voice was careful, measured. Don't. James's tone could have frozen mercury. You sent me a message about discussing something in person. What was it? Victor glanced around the cafe, then leaned forward. You already know, don't you? I need to hear it from you. Victor pulled out his phone, unlocked it with his thumbprint, and slid it across the table. Helen's been asking questions about our offshore accounts, shell companies, the whole structure. Called 3 contractors last week, trying to get details about our holdings in Marinder. James examined the call logs displayed on the screen, his expression hardening with each swipe. And they followed protocol. Denied everything. Of course. But that's not all. Victor paused, choosing his next words carefully. I've seen her car at the Glen building 4 times in the last month. Jared Thompson's office. James's eyebrows rose. You know about him. I heard them last night. Helen. And Diana. James said, his knuckles whitening around his coffee cup. They're planning to take everything in the divorce. The house, the business. His eyes met Victor's. You. Victor barked a laugh, but there was no humor in it. She actually thinks I'd work for her. You've noticed things I missed. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Victor shifted uncomfortably. Remember Harold? How his wife turned everything around when he tried to warn her, made him look paranoid, controlling. He shook his head. I needed proof first. Concrete evidence that couldn't be explained away. I'm not Harold, James said flatly. And this isn't going to play out like that. What do you need? James pulled out his laptop, powering it on with quick, efficient movements. Start with the Emerald accounts. Transfer everything through the Marinder shell, then route it to the new structures we set up last quarter. His fingers flew across the keyboard. I want it untraceable. That'll take time. The board won't know. James's voice cut through Victor's protest. As far as they're concerned, we're just diversifying our holdings. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Unless you have concerns about helping me. I've been with you since you were coding in your garage, Victor said quietly. Since before Alvarez Solutions was more than just an idea scribbled on a napkin. That doesn't change because your wife thinks she can buy me. Good. James turned the laptop so Victor could see the screen. Because we've got work to do. For the next hour, they worked in focused silence, dismantling and reassembling James's financial empire piece by piece. Shell companies were restructured, assets moved through a labyrinth of international accounts, ownership records carefully obscured. What about the AI project? Victor asked finally. Helen's been asking about it specifically. James's fingers stilled on the keyboard. What exactly did she want to know? Development timeline, potential applications. She tried to get access to the test results last week, Victor said, pulling up another set of logs on his phone. Said you had authorized it. Show me. James read through the exchange, his expression darkening. She's getting sloppy, making mistakes. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's time to set some bait. James started typing again. Create a shadow version of the project, something that looks real enough to fool someone who doesn't understand the technology. A trap. Let's see what she does with it, James said, smiling thinly. And more importantly, who she shares it with. And Diana? Victor asked carefully. What about her? James's expression hardened. She made her choice. She's 17, James. Kids that age are old enough to know better. James closed the laptop with a snap. I heard her, Victor. She's not some innocent bystander. She's part of this. Maybe if you talk to her. I need you to focus on something else. James cut him off. Find out everything you can about Jared Thompson. Every deal, every client, every penny he's earned or borrowed in the last decade. You think he's after more than just Helen. I think nothing about this is what it seems. James pulled out his phone as it buzzed. A text from Helen. Missing you already. Dinner at 7. He typed back, can't wait. How long can you keep this up? Victor asked, watching him pocket the phone. Playing along. As long as necessary. James stood, gathering his things. Keep me updated on Jared. And Victor. He paused. Don't trust anyone else with this. Not yet. The next few weeks unfolded like a complex game of chess, each move carefully calculated. James attended board meetings, closed deals, and came home each night to the performance of a loving family. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. The new cameras captured it all. Helen's hushed phone calls in the garden, her voice carrying clearly through high-end directional microphones. "No, Jared, he doesn't suspect anything. You should see him, still bringing me coffee in bed like nothing's wrong." Diana's secret meetings with Jared at various coffee shops, recorded by discreet surveillance teams. "My dad trusts me completely," she told Jared over a caramel macchiato. "He still thinks I'm his little girl." And the way Helen and Diana discussed their plans when they thought they were alone, unaware of the microscopic lens recording their every word. "Kenny says we should push for controlling interest in the tech division," Helen told Diana one afternoon in the kitchen. "Your father's too emotionally attached to see its real value." "What about his new project?" "The AI thing?" Diana asked. "That's the prize." Helen's smile was predatory. "Jared has buyers lined up. Foreign investors who don't care about NDAs or non-compete clauses." James watched each video in his penthouse office, face impassive. Every revelation was another piece of ammunition, carefully stored away for the right moment. Victor provided regular updates on Jared's background, each report more damning than the last. "Found something interesting," Victor said during one of their coffee shop meetings. "Jared Thompson isn't his real name." James looked up from his laptop. "Go on." "Real name's Kenneth Morrison. Changed it legally in 2019. Victor pushed a file across the table. "Want to guess why?" "Tell me." 3 failed real estate ventures in Westland. Investors lost millions. And here's the kicker. He's got a wife and 3 kids in Edgeport. James opened the file, scanning its contents. "Does Helen know?" "No sign she's done any real background checking." "She's buying his whole successful realtor act." "Make copies of everything," James instructed. "We'll need it later." The confrontation came sooner than he planned. He was working late in his home office, reviewing the latest batch of surveillance footage, when Helen sauntered in, a thick envelope in her hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying that false note of concern he now recognized so clearly. James didn't look up from his computer. "About?" "I think you know." She perched on the edge of his desk, trying to catch his eye. The movement knocked over a framed photo of their wedding day. James watched it fall, making no move to catch it. "This isn't working anymore," she said. "Hasn't been for a long time." "Define this." "Us. This marriage. This life." She gestured around the office. "When was the last time we really talked, really connected?" "Probably around the time you started sleeping with Jared Thompson." The color drained from Helen's face, but she recovered quickly, too quickly. She'd rehearsed this conversation. James realized, planned for this possibility. "So you know," she said. "I know a lot of things." He turned his screen, showing her footage of her garden conversations. "Would you like to see more? Maybe the coffee shop meetings, the furniture shopping." "You've been spying on me." Her voice rose in practiced outrage. "How dare you?" Interesting reaction from someone who's been selling my company secrets to foreign investors. That stopped her cold. Real fear flickered across her face before she could mask it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No." James pulled up another video. Helen and Jared in his office, discussing the AI project. "Shall we watch it together? The part where you offer to steal proprietary technology might be particularly interesting to our lawyers." "You're trying to intimidate me." Helen straightened, smoothing her skirt. "It won't work. I have rights. Half of everything we built." "We?" James's laugh was cold. "What exactly did you build, Helen, besides an elaborate plot to steal what I spent 20 years creating?" "I gave up my career for you." She shot back. "You mean your career as a junior realtor, the one you've suddenly revived with Jared's help?" James stood slowly, his height forcing her to step back from the desk. Speaking of Jared, does he know? Know what? About the embezzlement charges in Westland. The investors he defrauded. James smiled thinly. The wife and 3 kids in Edgeport. Helen's facade cracked. You're lying. Am I? He slid the folder across the desk. Take a look. Victor's very thorough with background checks. Her hands trembled as she opened the file. James watched her face as she read, seeing the moment reality set in. The color drained from her cheeks, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against pale skin. This can't be true, she whispered. The Jared Thompson you know is as real as our marriage, James said, his voice like ice. He's a con man, Helen, and you're not his first target. I don't believe you. Believe what you want. But before you file those papers, he pointed to the divorce documents she brought. Remember that I have copies of every conversation, every plan, every attempt to steal company information. How do you think the board would react? The police. You wouldn't. Try me. The 2 words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Helen stood, her composure cracking. This isn't over. Actually, it is. James sat back down, turning to his computer. I'm moving out tonight. You can keep the house. It's already been transferred to a separate holding company along with everything else. What does that mean? It means the assets you thought you were getting don't exist anymore. At least not where you can reach them. He looked up at her shocked face. Did you really think I wouldn't protect myself? That I'd just stand by and watch you and Jared dismantle my life? Diana will never forgive you for this. Diana made her choice, James said flatly. She can live with the consequences, just like you. Helen grabbed the divorce papers, her hands shaking. You'll regret this. No, Helen, James said, turning back to his work. I won't. He didn't look up. Close the door on your way out. She stormed out, heels clicking angrily on the hardwood. James waited until the sound faded before pulling out his phone. Victor, start the next phase. And revoke Helen's credentials, all of them. Yes, even the house codes. He paused, listening. No, I don't care if she's locked out. She can call a locksmith. He ended the call, staring at the family photo on his desk. The 3 of them at Diana's 16th birthday, all smiles and false happiness. Tomorrow, he'd move into the penthouse he'd secretly purchased months ago. Let Helen keep the house, an empty trophy for her hollow victory. His phone buzzed again. A message from Jared. We should talk. James smiled grimly. Yes, they should. But not until everything was in place. Not until Jared realized just how badly he'd miscalculated. The game was entering its final phase, and James Alvarez didn't intend to leave any pieces on the board. The first signs of Helen's downfall came exactly 3 weeks after James moved out. He sat in his penthouse office, multiple monitors displaying feeds from the surveillance system he'd left behind in the house. Each camera captured the unraveling in perfect high-definition clarity. Helen paced the kitchen, still wearing her clothes from the real estate firm, though her usual polished appearance had begun to fray at the edges. Her hair, normally perfectly styled, looked limp and unwashed. An empty wine glass sat on the counter beside a half-finished bottle of James's expensive Bordeaux. Her phone rang, Jared's name flashing on the screen. She snatched it up before the first ring ended. Please tell me you have good news, she said, foregoing any greeting. We have a problem. Jared's voice crackled through the speaker. What kind of problem? I just tried to access the offshore accounts we tracked. They're gone. Helen's hand tightened on the phone. What do you mean, gone? Exactly what I said. Every account, every asset we identified. They've either been moved or liquidated. That's impossible. I'm his wife. I have access to those accounts. Check again, Helen. I have, Jared. 3 times. Her voice rose, hysteria creeping in. He knew. Somehow he knew. We need to move faster. File the papers now. Before. I already did. Helen's laugh held an edge of desperation. He didn't even blink, just smiled, and said good luck, like it was all some kind of joke. Silence stretched across the line. Then, we need to meet. Tonight. Can't you come here? Helen asked. No. Jared's response was too quick. The coffee shop on 5th, 8 o'clock. Jared. 8 o'clock, Helen. Don't be late. The line went dead. James switched to another feed. Diana's room. His daughter sat at her desk, surrounded by the detritus of her former life. College acceptance letters that had once filled her with pride now lay crumpled in the trash. Her laptop screen showed her banking app. The accounts James had funded so generously over the years, now reduced to their minimum balances. Helen's voice carried up from below. Diana, I'm going out. Don't wait up. No response. Diana just kept staring at her screen, refreshing the page as though the numbers might magically change. She opened her email, where fresh rejection letters from scholarship committees waited. Without his backing, her dream schools had suddenly become financially impossible. Turn on the coffee shop feed. James instructed Victor, who sat monitoring another set of screens across the office. The new image showed Jared already waiting, fidgeting with his Rolex, a fake, James now knew, like everything else about the man. Helen arrived 7 minutes late, her entrance lacking its usual confidence. Where's my drink? She demanded, sliding into the booth. Jared ignored the question. We have bigger problems than coffee. Like what? Like my wife showing up at the office today. Helen's face went pale. Your what? My wife, Caroline, from Edgeport. Jared's practiced charm had vanished, replaced by barely controlled panic. Someone sent her proof of our marriage license. And apparently, I have some explaining to do about the other two Mrs. Thompsons as well. Other two. Helen's voice faded to a whisper. You're married. Was married. Am married. It's complicated. Jared ran a hand through his hair. The point is, we need to accelerate our timeline. Helen laughed, the sound brittle. What timeline? Everything's gone, Jared. The accounts, the properties. James somehow moved it all before I could file. There must be something left. The house is worthless without the other assets. Helen leaned forward. What aren't you telling me? Jared's eyes darted around the coffee shop. Some investors. They're asking questions about deals I promised them, about technology I said I could acquire. The AI project. Helen's face hardened. You told them you could get James's AI project. Among other things. Jared wouldn't meet her eyes. Look, we can still salvage this if we move fast. How many? Helen cut him off. How many wives? How many investors, Jared? He stood abruptly. I need to go. I'll call you. Jared. But he was already gone, leaving Helen alone in the booth. James switched back to the house feed. Diana had moved from her desk to her bed, clutching the stuffed penguin he brought her from Greenland last year. Her phone lay beside her, open to her chat history with Jared. The messages painted a clear picture. Jared playing the role of caring future stepfather, gradually drawing her into their scheme with promises of a better life, a more attentive father figure. The Jared situation is developing nicely, Victor reported, scanning through documents on his tablet. His real wife, the first one, filed bigamy charges this morning. Seems someone anonymously sent her quite a package of evidence. How unfortunate, James said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Any investors? Running scared. Once they realized Jared's real estate empire was built on fraud, they couldn't distance themselves fast enough. Victor swiped to another document. Helen's firm is cutting ties too. Put her on unpaid leave, pending an investigation. James nodded, satisfaction coursing through him. He had built his fortune by understanding systems, how they worked, how they could be manipulated. Helen and Jared had thought they were playing chess. They hadn't realized he was playing a different game entirely. His phone buzzed with texts from Helen. We need to talk. Please. Everything's falling apart. Just give me a chance to explain. James, I know you're reading these. Please respond. He left them all unanswered. Hours later, the penthouse elevator chimed. James looked up from his work to see Diana stepping out, her face pale but determined. She'd lost weight since he'd moved out, her designer clothes hanging loosely on her frame. Security had let her up. I told them I was your daughter, she said, taking a hesitant step forward. Or am I not that anymore? You tell me, James said, turning one of his monitors to show footage of her meetings with Jared. Seems you had a different father picked out. The screen showed Diana and Jared at various coffee shops, him leaning forward with practiced concern while she shared details about James's schedule, habits, vulnerabilities. I didn't. Diana's voice cracked. I didn't understand what was happening. Mom said you were never there, that you cared more about your company than us. Jared said he could help make things better. Better for all of us. Better. James's laugh was sharp. By stealing my life's work. By plotting with your mother to destroy everything I've built. That's not what. No, please. She wiped her eyes angrily. Everything's ruined now. Mom's a mess, Jared's gone, and all my college money. Actions have consequences, James said, turning back to his work. Consider it a life lesson, one you clearly needed. That's it. 17 years as your daughter means nothing. You stopped being my daughter the moment you joined her plot. He didn't look up. The door is behind you. Dad, please, get out. The words fell like ice. And don't come back. She stood there for a long moment, shoulders shaking. Then, without another word, she turned and fled to the elevator. James watched on the security feed as she broke down in the lobby, the guard he'd once trusted with her safety now politely escorting her from the building. His phone buzzed again, another text from Helen. Jared's gone, took everything. Please help. He deleted it without responding. Days turned into weeks. James watched through his surveillance network as their carefully constructed plan crumbled. The house Helen had coveted sat mostly empty now. She could barely afford the utilities. Jared had disappeared, leaving a trail of angry investors and multiple wives in his wake. And Diana. Diana spent her days in her room, her dreams of college fading with each rejection letter from the prestigious schools that had once courted her. The beginning of each month brought new evidence of their downfall. Helen's credit cards were declined at increasingly modest establishments. Diana's cell phone service was cut off. The cleaning service stopped coming. The gardener quit when his checks bounced. James observed it all from his penthouse fortress, taking cold satisfaction in each small collapse point. One evening, as he reviewed acquisition proposals, Victor arrived with a final update. Jared's been arrested in Bayfield, he reported, dropping a file on James's desk. Tried to flee to Arlia on a fake passport. Local police got an anonymous tip. How unfortunate for him, James said, his smile still grim. That's not all, Victor said, sitting heavily in one of the visitor chairs. Helen's asking about reconciliation. Says she'll sign whatever you want. No conditions. James's laugh was razor sharp. A bit late for that, isn't it? She's desperate. The firm fired her officially this morning. Victor hesitated. And Diana called again. Asked if you'd at least talk to her. Did she? James's voice was flat. She's your daughter, James. No. He stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My daughter died the night I heard them plotting in that kitchen. What's left is just another reminder of their betrayal, James continued. And Helen. Let her keep the house, James said without turning. It's worth almost nothing now anyway. I made sure of that. She wanted to play games with my life's work. Fine. Game over. She lost. And you? Victor asked quietly. Did you win? I survived, James said, turning from the window, his expression hard. That's what matters. He walked back to his desk. Now, about that expansion in Marinder. Victor recognized the dismissal and stood to leave. At the elevator, he paused. She'll try again, Diana. She won't give up easily. Then she'll learn another lesson, James said, not looking up from his work. Everyone has a breaking point. She's found mine. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, leaving James alone in his penthouse fortress. Below, the city sprawled like a circuit board, each light a connection, each street a pathway. He'd rebuilt his empire, protected his legacy. The cost had been high, but it always was. His phone buzzed one final time. A text from Diana. I know you'll never forgive us, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Goodbye, Dad. James picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with deliberate precision, he blocked her number, and Helen's as well. One by one, he erased every connection to his old life. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows through the penthouse windows. In the gathering darkness, James Alvarez sat alone, surrounded by the empire he'd saved, and the family he'd lost. He pulled up the security feed one last time. Helen sat in their once pristine kitchen, now showing signs of neglect, clutching what looked like an old photo album, her shoulders shaking with sobs. In her room, Diana stared out the window, her college acceptance letters still scattered across the floor. James closed the feeds with a decisive click. They'd made their choices, and now they could live with the consequences. He regretted nothing.